Welcome to the webinar, the Fiorano webinar, PSD to Compliance, Stressing Out. Relax, it shouldn't be that difficult. Please take a moment, 1 minute, to familiarize yourselves with the operation for the webinar. As far as the audio is concerned, we will be keeping it on mute during the presentation. If you have any problems with your screen, please, if you want to go into full screen mode, press the blue button on the right hand of the screen to broaden the screen. And if you have any questions, please enter your questions in the Q&A box available at the bottom right side of your screen, and we will answer those questions at the end of the webinar. Please use only one type of audio. If you're on the webinar, use webinar audio. Please do not have your phone on at the same time, as that sometimes causes feedback situations. So we'll take 1 minute for everybody to get familiar, and then we'll launch into presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. So our presenters today will be Jason Bloomberg and Atul Saini. Jason is a leading industry analyst and expert in agile architectures, and advises on digital transformation initiatives for many corporations worldwide. Jason is an author and has published a number of popular books, The Agile Architecture Revolution and Service-Oriented or Be Doomed, and How Service Orientation Works for your enterprise. Atul Saini will be presenting as well. Atul founded Fiorano Software in 1995. And has ushered us through the successful introduction of our ESB products, API products, and many others. He's been at the forefront of the integration industry for peer-to-peer distributed processing. He's one of the first entrepreneurs to realize the power of microservices, as we've been deploying microservices in the Fiorano environment for many years now. So without any ado, I would like to hand it over to Jason Bloomberg. Jason?
Thank you very much, Tom. Let's see if we can get the slides moving along. Today we're talking about PSD2 compliance. Worried, of course, that we're stressing you out or that it's stressing you out, but it really shouldn't be that difficult. So let's get right into it here. And if you give me the control, there we are. Okay, so okay, here we are. Okay, we got it figured out. Okay, so just a bit about me. I'm president of Intellyx, an industry analyst firm focused on agile digital transformation. There's a picture of my latest book, and we also published the Agile Digital Transformation Roadmap poster. I'll have the URL for that at the end of the presentation. So I know that a number of you are familiar with PSD2, but because we can't assume that everybody is, just some very basics just to get everybody on the same page. PSD stands for Payment Services Directive, and the original PSD dates from 2007, a set of regulations in the European Union for regulating payment services providers throughout Europe. By 2013 then, it was time to update PSD, and out came PSD2, providing better consumer protection and security, incorporating a variety of emerging payment methods, and really the notion of the cloud was now part of the story as well in terms of cloud scalability, cloud availability. So that is now the basis of PSD2 and why we couldn't do all of this in 2007. So one of the key benefits and also the key challenges of PSD2 is that it provides for a direct connection between merchants and banks via APIs, and that's the part that may be stressing you out. So PSD2 has a set of regulations, introduces a number of third parties that are lumped together called third-party payment service providers, or TPPs. And there's different types of TPPs that do different things. There's initiation services providers, account information service providers, and there's actually a few more. So on the plus side, there's new business opportunities. You may be one or more of these. That's a new opportunity for new businesses. But it's also a challenge because we have more parties to integrate with. So, and all of these are expected to be in the cloud. They're all providing essentially SaaS capabilities. So let's take a closer look at the regulation. So I had to dig through, a bunch of websites, a lot of verbiage, and I found a paragraph that is really an example of how these regulations are written. So, if you're a techie and you're dealing with regulatory compliance, you may have never actually looked at the regulation itself that you're working on. So I thought I would make it be illustrative of what we're dealing with to actually look at the regulation itself. So there's the footnote in terms of the actual name of the regulation. We call it PSD2. There's the actual name of it. It's like 3 lines long. And there's the URL where I found this. This is one paragraph out of many, many, it's like 80 pages long. So if you look at this paragraph, this one is actually saying that you have to provide access to the payment service provider to the technical infrastructures of payment systems, subject to appropriate requirements to ensure integrity and stability. Okay, so what does the regulation say about how to access the systems? Well, it doesn't say. What does it say about the protocols needed? It doesn't say. What does it say about security? Well, you have to ensure integrity and stability. Presumably that includes security, but it doesn't even say security. That's essentially part of what you're supposed to read into this kind of text. So if you look at this, the challenge here is that really, how do you know if what you're doing on the technical side is compliant with this paragraph or any of the other paragraphs? Well, that's part of the challenge of regulatory compliance generally, right? And that's really the nature of regulation. So if we look at the regulatory context, well, who is writing these things? Well, definitely not techies, right? These are politicians, policy experts, lobbyists, right? People with political science degrees, not technical degrees. So you wouldn't expect to find any technical specifics. So generally speaking, then, it is up to the participants, in this case, the TPPs, the banks, the merchants, to decide for themselves how to implement the regulations. Now, you can't just sort of make stuff up as you go, because obviously the regulators will come in and look at what you're doing and give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. So there's this whole business of lawyers working with big companies, hammering out what does it mean to comply with regulations, looking at technical implementations and judging whether or not they are sufficient to meet the regulations. So, but the regulations themselves don't tell you that, right? It's the lawyers and the policy experts working in a community that are coming up with standard ways of representing message formats and API formats that are built after the fact, right? A regulation comes along, now a standards body looks at it and says, well, here's what we'll say is the standard way of representing these messages. But the bottom line is you don't necessarily have to comply with the standard to be compliant with the regulation, right? So it's really up to you as an organization what specific steps you take in order to be compliant, as long as when the regulators come in, they agree that you have done the right things, right? And so it's definitely a black art from the perspective of technology. Technology is the easy part, right? I mean, sort of black and white, does the message go through or not? Is it secure or not? But in terms of the regulatory context, there's a lot of gray areas, a lot of politics going on. And that's just the nature of regulation, nothing specific to PSD2. It's just the nature of regulation, and always has been. So moving on, we mentioned earlier in the deck that PSD2 allows for direct connection between various parties via APIs. Unlike PSD and really most transaction processing that's been going on since we used technology to do such things, has always depended on some sort of clearinghouse, some sort of intermediary. And now the burden was put on the intermediary to make sure it had interactions with all of the parties that it was trying to connect. Well, now we have this provision for direct connection. And so this now complicates the regulatory compliance challenge, right? Because it's not just a burden on the clearinghouse to ensure that all the parties it deals with are compliant, but now it's up to the parties themselves. And keep in mind that Party A and Party B may not actually agree on the specifics, the technical specifics of how to comply. And that's part of the challenge, right? So, so a bank may say, here's our API formats, here's our message formats, and then a merchant or a TPP might say, well, here's our message format. And they may not be exactly the same, right? And everybody thinks they're compliant, and everybody is doing it the way they expect to have to do it to be compliant, but there's no guarantee that everything is going to match up. And that's part of the challenge. Now keep in mind, PSD2 raises the bar on a number of things, not just the direct connections and the performance required, right? If you're a consumer and you're in a retail establishment, you expect a transaction to go through in a matter of seconds. Obviously, PSD2 can't slow that down to minutes. That would never do. Security, obviously, a huge concern, especially now that we have all of these parties, right? So the threat service has expanded enormously. Obviously, we have every party involved has to be proactive with regard to security. Consumer protection, consumer permission is an essential part of the EU regulatory structure. We were just talking about, before this webinar started, about GDPR being a set of regulations that are, if anything, more urgent than PSD2 and broader, really applying to any company dealing with information of EU citizens. Well, that is essential to compliance with GDPR as well as PSD2. Right? PSD2 implementations have to be GDPR compliant, right? So you can't just pick one or the other. And everything has to be resilient, right? If there's a problem somewhere, you have to be able to recover from that failure as rapidly as we now have come to expect from appropriately architected cloud deployments. So that's all part of the story as well. In this broader context of direct connection between parties that support all of these architectural priorities. So, never forget though, that PSD2 really boils down to a set of regulations. So we can talk about all the technical implementations, and you may can be in a technical context where you're running through their test cases, the test pass, and you put it to deployment, and everything is working. Well, just because everything is working from a technical perspective does not necessarily guarantee that you're compliant. Right, so there are additional things you have to do beyond the technical testing and deployment lifecycle in order to be compliant. Remember as well, compliance is mandatory. It's not optional. So your organization is counting on you, the technical team, to ensure that the organization that you're supporting has jumped through all the hoops necessary. So it's not good enough simply to be compliant. You have to be able to prove you're compliant, right? So it has to be verifiable. So there's always this context of maintaining appropriately verifiable audit trails so that if something does go wrong or if a regulator does look at what you're doing, they can get the information they need to ensure that you are properly compliant. And if there is some sort of problem, that you have dealt with it properly. Now, in terms of breaches, in terms of a hacker breaking in, experiencing a breach puts you out of compliance, right? So it doesn't matter what you did to prevent the breach. If your cybersecurity protections failed, that inherently makes you out of compliance. The regulations are requiring you to prevent breaches. So it's sort of a double whammy because obviously you cannot prevent every single breach. Right? There's no such thing as perfect security. But the burden, the regulatory burden is on you to do just that. Right? You have to prevent every breach. So who gets the short end of the stick, right? If there is a breach and now you're out of compliance, so your CEO is getting fined and there's your stock price dips, well, who are they going to point to? They're going to point to the techies, right? Who are responsible for ensuring the security. So you can't blame the hackers, right? It's really everybody's responsibility in the organization to ensure regulatory compliance, including the prevention of breaches, even though that is a very high bar to meet. Okay, so if you look at now the ecosystem, and this diagram is actually a very simplified illustration of the ecosystem. There are other parties as well and other points of interaction, but it does give you some idea of what's going on here, right? We have the merchant's bank, the customer's bank, and the merchant. We've had those before, but now we have these other parties, the PISP and AISP. Those are these third-party payment providers. They're doing different things. And we have the merchant website, if it's an e-commerce transaction, maybe a card not present. And then if the consumer is using a mobile app, there's the merchant mobile backend as well, which, keep in mind, the website and the mobile backend are typically hosted at third parties, right? They're typically in the cloud, not in a merchant data center. They may or may not be, but they are often in a cloud environment. So we have other parties as well. So we have all of these arrows now involving direct connections that supported by APIs. All of this has to be compliant. All of this has to be secure. And the regulations don't specify the specifics of the APIs, right? So that sort of is the big picture challenge that we have to deal with. Okay, so we started off saying that it shouldn't stress you out, and now I'm probably stressing you out. So let's see if we can reduce the stress levels here. So if we look at the merchants and we look at the third-party payment providers, they each have concerns, and some of those are the same, but there's some different as well, right? The merchants need to work with multiple payment providers, so they have to have API support for those. Well, the payment providers have to work with multiple merchants, right? So it's similar, but somewhat different in terms of the requirements there. Everybody has to be secure, scalable, and resilient, so that is common across all the parties. And then the interactions as well with the back-end interactions, merchants still have to deal with banks, especially their own bank, and the third-party providers have to deal with end-user devices, right? So there's any number of different end-user devices because you can make payments with your phones, you can make payments online on a website, and then there's the in-store, the terminals as well, and all the other new devices coming on market that merchants are using in different contexts. So everything from what you use in a taxi cab to what you use at a farmer's market, right? All sorts of different devices. So there's some overlap here, but largely different. And the overlap is primarily architectural, right? Scalability, resilience, security. Those are the common areas. But the specifics of the message formats and message interactions may vary depending upon the parties involved and the purpose of those messages. Okay, so how do we solve these problems? Well, it boils down to architectural best practice, right? We're talking a lot about the cloud-based architecture, scalability, resilience. Well, we also have abstraction. And if you have an architectural background or you're a senior level developer that's been working in an architectural context, then this is familiar to you, right? Abstractions are separations of concerns that essentially allow different parties to focus on different problems, right? So the different layers of the architecture that support different participants who now have different concerns, some more business-oriented, some more technical. And a well-architected abstraction layer also provides loose coupling. Loose coupling is something we talked about in the service-oriented architecture days, and even though we've moved beyond, on-premises SOA from the 2000s, now we're talking more about cloud-based microservices architectures. Loose coupling is still every bit as important, because loose coupling basically means that you have multiple parties involved in interactions, and it gives each party the flexibility to make changes, to do different things, without breaking the interaction. And this is fundamental to solving this problem, to reducing your stress level, right? If party A and party B are trying to interact via an API and their formats or their specifications are slightly different, then if there is no abstraction providing loose coupling, then they will have a broken interaction. And you have to go in and manually fix things, and that's what we want to avoid. So with the appropriate abstraction, with the appropriate architecture, then we have a way of essentially representing those API interactions in an abstracted way, so that the parties may not have to worry about the specific differences between the API interactions or the message formats. And now that's something that we learned how to do the hard way when we're implementing SOA back in the day. Now we're taking those lessons and moving them forward to the cloud and microservices world we have today. So if we look at some of the specifics, how do we actually implement the abstraction? Well, if you look at what we learned from the SOA days, yes, it depended upon the appropriate use of middleware. Moving that forward to 2017, we have API management. So API management is more than just ensuring your APIs are up and running. It's also supporting this abstraction, right? Being able to represent the message formats for one endpoint and the message formats for another endpoint. And if there is some sort of transformation or some sort of waving hands in the middle, that's taken care of by the API management. So you're able to abstract any differences in API formats or message formats. Of course, the integration technology themselves, those have matured, right? With the ESBs we talked about in 2005, the ones that are still on the market are far more mature. They're lightweight, they're cloud-centric, they're no longer centered on on-premises integration. So now those are now a central part of the story. They provide the performance, security, as well as the loose coupling. And the loose coupling is something that we haven't talked that much about over the last few years, right? Because there's all these other architectural concerns that have sort of been more interesting to discuss. But loose coupling is a central part of the story, and that's something we need to depend upon the appropriate integration technologies to do. And of course, we're in this modern world, scalability, resilience in the cloud. Now we have to take for granted, but obviously you have to do it right? So it's one thing to say we take the cloud for granted. It's another thing to say that we're getting all these things right. So we have to ensure that we've properly architected everything we're doing, so that we have the scalability, resilience, the automatic deployments, automatic elasticity, self-service access for the various parties, and it has to be hidden from view, right? In terms of the underlying technology infrastructure, that's something we don't want all of these third parties to have to worry about. Keep in mind, we have all these different third parties, merchants and TPPs and mobile service providers, and some of them are more up to speed on the specifics of these technical details. Others are less up to speed, right? So we have to realize that because we're allowing for direct interconnections among a wide variety of parties, we don't necessarily have high levels of technical expertise at every location, right? So you want to allow for that fact and provide essentially the ease of use of the cloud, right? The self-service, simple interaction for these third parties, so that you can easily enroll merchants and all the other aspects that you need to do that we don't want to require high levels of technical expertise that will slow us down and raise our costs. So that's it for my talk. So my email address, the eBiz Wizard, is my Twitter handle. If you'd like a copy of the poster, go to agiledigitaltransformation.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Atul.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everybody. My name is Atul Seni. I'm the CEO and CTO of Fiorano. And what we're going to be talking about today is essentially the technical aspects of how we can simplify PSD2 implementations. So just to go over the PSD2 requirements, you have a single view of the entire financial account status, financial history, will be maintained with third party, strong authentication, security is critical. As Jason had mentioned, security, scalability, resilience, we'll address all those issues. So, and to give you another view, PSD2, just to recap, essentially creates a third party which maintains all your accounts. So if you have 3 bank accounts, instead of going to each bank separately, having a separate security token for each bank, and learning the different flows of software within each bank and having transactions stored at the bank, the concept is that there'll be a third party, they'll have all your accounts, and whenever you want to make a payment, you create one set of beneficiaries and say, hey, from, for instance, my HSBC account, please transfer this many dollars or pounds or whatever currency you want to a given beneficiary. That's the concept. So it's actually a very useful concept, and you'll have all of your transactions from the different banks stored with the TPP, in this case, which is showing the PISP. So the question becomes, how is this whole thing implemented now? Can you simplify it? To understand the implementation, we're going to go over just the requirements and the set of flows that you have in the whole process. So the first concept is, you're a customer and you contact a PISP. The TPP could be a PISP, which is a payment initiation service provider, or an AISP, which is an account information service provider, right? Or both, and both together are called ASPSP, right? So the third party essentially must connect to your bank. If you want the third party to pay, let's say, £60 to somebody from HSBC, the third party's got to connect to the bank, right? So this has to be a very secure connection, which is unhackable, or at least something that a hacker can't get into, right? And then when you decide that you want to pay a particular beneficiary, you let the bank know that, and the bank has to come back to you with the exchange rate, the transfer fee, these two items, the exchange rate and the transfer fee. If you're transferring, let's say, from one currency to another, all banks will give you the exchange rate and the transfer fee. And different banks have different rates and transfer fees, right? PSD2 adds another requirement called the time requirement for the payment. There's a time requirement for the payment. So the bank actually has to give you a guarantee that this whole transaction will be done in 20 minutes or 2 hours, 3 hours or whatever, right? And the amount of the transaction, most critically, the amount of transaction and the name of the beneficiary has to be taken into account in the security process. So in addition to creating a very secure connection to the bank, a secure time-bound connection, at the time of the transfer, an additional level of security involves what's called PKCE, Proof Key Code Exchange. It means that it's going to become extremely difficult for a hacker to get in, because for every interaction between the third party and the bank, a different hash is being used, which depends on the amount of money that is requested by the TPP to be transferred. So it makes it, and that's not particularly easy to implement. So just to give you an idea, these are all requirements. Now, for certain transaction limits, if the transaction limit is beyond a certain point, the bank has to do a two-factor authentication with the customer, and that can be done either over multiple channels. Basically, it's a one-time password where SMS or other methods on the mobile phone, right? So after the two-factor authentication has been done and you have all the required information, the bank goes ahead and does the transfer to the beneficiary's bank, and that final transfer is really done using the normal clearing and settlement mechanism of the bank, right? Finally, there are additional acknowledgements from the customer bank back to the third party, and also from the beneficiary's bank, depending on how the architecture is set up. So, what are the challenges, the technical challenges? The first step is for the third party, which we showed in the diagrams as PISP, they've got to connect to the bank. And that requires the bank to expose its interfaces, and that requires strong API management technology at the bank. So, the bank has to have an API management system, has to expose certain APIs, which are then used by the third party to connect to the bank. Now, once you connect it in, locally, to implement those APIs, you typically need an ESB. You can do a lot of programming, but what happens is programming systems are typically tightly coupled. The ESB allows you to have loose coupling, make changes very, very quickly. You can add new APIs quickly. All of the benefits that Jason talked about of loose coupling are really implemented at the API level. And from the standpoint of scaling, the API management server has a peer-to-peer architecture as well. So you just add additional gateway servers as the number of third parties connecting to your bank goes up massively, right? So besides the API management and the ESB at the end of the bank, you also have to maintain a cryptographic trace of every transaction, both at the bank and at the PISP. That means that for every step has to be recorded, that you've received the information from the PISP that this payment has to be made. So if there's an error at any point, there's a full transaction history, and the customer can be told this is exactly where the failure occurred, if indeed the failure does occur, right? Now, let's get down to the actual implementation. We've told you what needs to be done. The critical point for banks to understand today is that to be compliant, there are two separate phases. Let's call them level 1 and level 2. For the PSD2 level 1 implementation, the bank only needs an API management platform and an ESB ideally. The bank's job as part of PSD2 implementation is only to expose its interfaces to allow third parties to call in. It is not a mandatory requirement for a bank to become a PISP or an AISP or an ASPSP. There are two separate things. Now, if you're a bank that's ambitious, ultimately many banks will want to become third parties because it's the third party that maintains the relationship with the customer. Under the PSD2 setup, the bank essentially becomes a provider to the third party, and the third party deals with the end customer. So that's the reason why a lot of banks want to become PISPs, right? But strictly speaking, you really have to understand that from an implementation standpoint, you can't start thinking of becoming a third party, which is level 2, before going through your level 1 implementation, which is to say, you actually have to create the APIs and expose the APIs to the third parties in a very secure, resilient, and scalable manner. And that requires you to get very strong API management technology, which scales, and ideally speaking, an enterprise service bus, which is used to implement the APIs and talk to your core banking system. This is really all you need for full PSD2 compliance, right? There's a lot of confusion in the industry. So what do the sample APIs look like, right? Payment initiation, you have, first, you have to allow a third party to call in, give you a name, and get the account details. Of course, all of this is done in a very secure way using OAuth security. So your API management platform allows the third party to create a time-bound tunnel with OAuth security and SSL for every connection. And then on top of that, implements the proof key code exchange for every transaction based on the amount of transaction, the name of the beneficiary. It makes it very, very, very difficult for hackers to get in, right? So you have to have at least these 5 APIs or variations of these. Now, it is not for the standards committee, it's not for the regulation to specify the formats of these APIs, because that is absolutely impossible. Every bank's going to implement things slightly differently. Now, our recommendation as Fiorano is going to be to use these formats that we've come up with, but there's going to be different vendors, different banks, each is going to want to do it differently, and so it's not something that is possible to specify in the regulation. That's another huge source of confusion in PSD2 implementations today, or even implementations that are being contemplated, right? So you're going to get the exchange rate, time taken for the transaction, the status of completion of the payment, and these are things that are going to be, these are APIs that are going to be called by the third party into your bank to create the software that allows finally the end user at the third party to actually perform payments. But please understand once again, as a bank, you just need to implement the API management platform and implement these APIs, and you are in full compliance. You don't have to be a third party. A lot of confusion has come from the level 2 implementation. There's a lot of vendors that sell software for the level 2 implementation. And level 2 requires consent management, onboarding of customers, and transaction storage. So here's what is level 2. If you are a third party, let's say you want to become a PISP. So a customer, Mr. Jones, comes along to you and says, hi, I've got 3 bank accounts, HSBC, Barclays, and Deutsche Bank. How do you know that Mr. Jones is who he is? So that process is called onboarding. You have to onboard Mr. Jones, and there's a whole slew of security measures. You've got to go and connect to the bank, connect to HSBC, for example, and say, this is Mr. Jones, this is the information he's given me. Can you verify this, please? Right? And then there's a whole onboarding process for that, which we'll talk about now. So what's happened is a lot of banks today are looking at these kinds of software solutions, consent management, onboard transaction storage, and saying, okay, this is PSD2. You can do this, of course, if you want to become a third party. But if you're a bank, you've got to go back to the API management portion of it. You've got to implement this, you see? You have to implement the API management, expose the right APIs, and only after that can you get to sort of become a third party. So what's involved in becoming a third party, right? So besides connecting to the bank and performing the whole set of flows that we talked about in the 2-factor authentications, the critical point is how do you onboard? So you have to have a key requirement is an identity and access management system. There are many vendors of such systems you can use. So Fiorano works either with third-party identity and access management systems or with an LDAP-based solution, right? So the customer, the TPP is going to be added to the identity and access management system. The various consents of the customer actually under GDPR rules, the customer has to consent to the TPP using the customer's name. The customer has to say, I authorize you, the TPP, to talk to HSBC on my behalf and execute all payments and various, there'll be a license agreement there, and you're going to essentially agree to allow the TPP to do the payments on your behalf. It's a serious thing, right? Because money's involved. So those are the sorts of things that are going to happen. The API management, the API management platform accesses the customer access rights during the policy enforcement. The policies are set at the API level. The previous, the APIs that are exposed, you can set policies in those to check various consents that the customer has given the consumer. You can also basically use an LDAP-based identity store to store the user information and the access rights. Then flows that are implemented at the ESB level while implementing the APIs. You see, the actual execution process from the third party just talks to the API management platform, and the ESB retrieves the user information from the information store and implements rules-based consent. So there's a way to implement the consent management using the ESB flows along with an LDAP store. So you don't necessarily have to use a third-party identity and access management system. At the PSD2 level, everything can be done just using LDAP and intelligent ESB flows. So, because most ESBs actually support the LDAP access to store the TPP details. So these are the various challenges that you have to go through from an implementation standpoint at the time that you wish to become a third party. And of course, a third party then has to have a whole methodology for storing the various transactions efficiently, and that typically just requires a relational database and software and solutions to be implemented as essentially like an application. So these are the challenges. The most important point to understand if you're a bank is you've got to basically go through two separate levels, two separate phases of the implementation. You have to go through level 1 implementation first. So you need an API, you need a proper ESB, and you need to do things fast, to make changes easily, the loose coupling, the security, the scalability. All of these things are built into these platforms, and they become very, very essential. You can't take shortcuts. So Fiorano has the sophisticated PSD2 infrastructure, the API management platform, the integrated ESB, and an auto-scalable architecture, which is really beyond the scope of this particular discussion, but it's been in deployment for many years in many financial institutions and other institutions. You have a real-time transaction history of all the consumer account activity, and we've got a fairly deep understanding of PSD2 semantics. All of these flows and the architecture has been developed in conjunction with very senior core banking architects at various core banking companies and big banks. So it's not something that Fiorano has come up with independently. There's been a lot of work behind this. So the solution features, just to summarize, the security, transparency, interoperability. You have secured connectivity, the PIXI implementation. At the TPP level, you get a full view of the account histories, end-to-end visibility, and it's a very customizable solution. But once again, every bank is probably not going to become a third party. The market probably can't support 20,000 third parties. If there's about 20,000 financial institutions, you're level, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 banks when you put them together, and everyone's got to implement this. Every bank can't become a PISP. That doesn't make much sense. So most banks all banks though have to have an API management platform and a proper ESB to expose the APIs properly. And that in itself is a bit of a challenge for a lot of banks, because a lot of the banks don't even have these technologies in place. So it's not super complex. The total number of APIs you have to implement is not very large. It's 5, 7, 10 APIs. You can always implement more APIs, because exposing various information to third parties is a good thing for business. But at the PSD2 level, it's not too many APIs. It's just figuring out exactly what to do. So we've tried to split it up in this webinar and show you if you follow the two separate phases, go with the level 1 implementation. You have to do that anyway. At that point, I get that fully right. Allow other PISPs to talk to you, and then look at becoming a PISP as well. So, at this point, we're ready for questions, and thanks very much for listening.
Give us a moment and we'll have the questions up, and we're accumulating them.
Perfect.
So the first question we have from Jean-Luc is there likely to be an agreement or a contract in place between the banks and the PISPs?
Strictly speaking, that's completely a separate thing from the regulation. Yes, I mean, a bank typically, if a PISP is going to connect to if anyone wants to connect to a bank, the bank typically has a fairly long contract. But that's just the security to protect its staff. It's not something that's mandated by the specification. But these are things that normally happen, just a separate agreement. From the standpoint of the end user's agreement is with the PISP, essentially. Because the end user uses deposits the information at the PISP, and then I would imagine that there is obviously going to be responsibilities for the PISP in dealing with the banks, but that's something that has to be independently negotiated by the PISP and the bank.
So at this time, we don't have any other questions. If anybody has any questions, please type your questions in the chat window provided, and we'll answer those. We'll give you a few minutes to get that done, and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, Atul, I don't know if you have any other comments, or Jason, if you have any other comments that you want to add to this whole business relationship that JP is asking about between the financial institutions and the PISPs and AISPs?
Well, yeah, I guess I could add a few comments. Business contracts are really about mitigating and distributing risk, right? If the relationship is going along swimmingly and there aren't any problems, then nobody really needs a contract, right? It's when you have a problem, there's a disagreement, there's some sort of loss, and you have to figure out who's responsible. That's when people look at the contract. So if you're working with a much larger organization, you're a small company, you're working with the bank, you'd better believe the bank has a whole team of lawyers whose sole responsibility is to come up with contracts that lower the risk to the bank, shifting such risk to all the other parties, right? So if you're a small company doing business with a big company, especially a bank because they're so risk adverse, you would expect the contract to have all this verbiage that is basically saying if something goes belly up, it's your fault, not the bank's fault. And so that now sort of, it's an asymmetric relationship. So that's one of the things that any of these parties, any of these TPPs has to deal with. And that's true of the merchants as well. If you're working with a big merchant, they're going to have the same team of lawyers. So it's always a challenge now being a small party involved in these, enterprise concerns, because you will have that asymmetric distribution of risk that any big company will require in order to do business with them.
Atul, since you've been so active in the PSD2 initiative, I know that you've been working very diligently on this for some time with our team. You might want to comment on what you're seeing in this area, or how that's developing.
Right. At this point, most of a lot of the concern that banks have is just how to get the base implementation up and running. And what we've tried to do as part of this webinar is to try to simplify that a little bit by saying that as a bank, you really needn't worry about becoming a third party immediately, because that can become very confusing. You really have to go step by step and look at becoming at level 1, putting in place a proper set of APIs that you can expose based on all the semantics available. So if most banks would follow this phased approach, that would be the best thing from a business standpoint, and also the fastest way to achieve full compliance, and then look at additional business benefits of becoming a third party, or just adding other APIs and dealing with third parties.
Okay, we just had one more question from Aidan Doherty. How long is it going to take to implement Fiorano's solution for level 1 solution? Atul, you might want to just comment quickly on that.
Yes, we worked out a lot of the details for this, depending on the core banking system and the team at the bank, sort of giving the right information, making that available to the ESP. It's about a 3 or 4 month implementation cycle, depending on the team size. You're looking at 3 people. This is really not a very expensive or a very large implementation. Just 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, right. And I would say one of the things, and this gets into a product area from an implementation perspective, Fiorano is known for its, let's just call it, speed of implementation. Fiorano doesn't require the amount of development most middleware products require. We are basically a configuration-based system that takes advantage of a lot of the different microservices that are already in place, and the components that are already in place, and adapters that are already in place, so we can very quickly configure the interaction between the various parties. So we can speed the implementation significantly, and of course that's going to depend on the size of the implementation. And we can do that with far fewer, if you will, developers or people that are required to get that done. So in our case, as Atul mentioned, 90 days is not out of the question, and it just, again, becomes a function of how complex and how large your implementation may be, and some of the other specific implementation issues that we may face. But again, Fiorano is very, very, very time to market oriented from a software perspective. We want to get people up and running. We want to do it in a simple format, and we've got basically all the underpinnings in our technology that enterprises require to do the things that we were talking about with the PSD2 initiative.
Yeah, it's about speed that comes from a very componentized microservice-centric architecture. So you basically are snapping things together rather than doing a lot of programming. We cut the programming time down. It's half the programmers, half the time. That's a sensitive issue because a lot of companies at PSD2 are selling massive consulting projects. To be very frank, such massive consulting projects are not needed. The typical budget from most of the larger consulting companies is 3 or 4 million euros, and that is definitely not very required, not seriously required. So that's those are the facts.
That's the basically the final question we have for today. So we appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you, Atul. Thank you, Jason. We will have this recording on our site.